Welcome to You, Me and the Counselling World, the podcast dedicated to student counsellors and their road to getting qualified and beyond. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by author Amy Peters as we discuss what she wished she'd known before working with neurodivergent clients. So, here we are. I'm joined here by the most wonderful lady, an author, and so she does so many different things that I'll let her tell you about some of the stuff that she does. But I'm joined with Amy Peters, and she's here today. And I just want to say a massive welcome to you, Amy. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much, Becky. Yeah, I'm really excited to have this conversation.
Yeah, I know, me too. And it's been a really kind of big week for you, hasn't it? And probably a bit over a week, hasn't it, since your book came out?
Yeah, the book came out just about a week and a half ago,
Yes.
and it's been a long time in the planning. So yes, it's been a massive thing that it's come out. Yeah, my first book, and it's very exciting, but also kind of surreal, I'll be honest.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. I've been so excited for you. I was excited. I thought of you so many times was it 21st of May, wasn't it, when it came out?
Yeah.
And I thought of you so many times during that day. And I know we were emailing a little bit. And yeah, it was just so exciting. But what's the weather like where you are? We might as well start in the way we normally start.
Yeah, it's pretty grey here, but to be honest, with the heat last week, I am just thankful that it's not 30 odd degrees, because I'd be honest, I really struggle with that. So yeah, I'm quite happy with the grey today.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, this room, when I'm recording, gets really warm with so many bits and bobs on. You know, it gets really, really warm. So it's really nice to just have it slightly less boiling hot as it has been. So anyway, I reckon that's enough about the weather. But I just want to say, where would you like to begin? Like, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, okay. So I'm a counsellor and I work in Kent in private practice. And when I started out, I started to draw in a lot of neurodivergent clients. And that became a bit of a theme for me in the early days. And I also, same kind of time, realised I was also autistic and ADHD, and then later on had the diagnosis for that. And really, I went on a deep dive then in terms of how I could better support these clients, because I was feeling there was a bit of a mismatch. So I've specialised in working with neurodivergent clients, mostly autistic and ADHD people. And now I have a private practice with 4 other counsellors working for me as well. And so we serve people within, as I say, within Kent and also online across the UK. And I think because of my ADHD, probably, I love doing all sorts of bits and pieces. So along the way, I've created resources, I've created training, and also, yeah, the website and so on, and now the book. So yeah, this is quite kind of hard to put that all into a small potted history, because yeah, I'm involved in all sorts of different bits and pieces, which I love, but it's also very tiring.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot, and I know we were talking about what the title of this podcast might be, and I sort of said, I can't list it all. So we've gone with author, haven't we? Because that feels like at the moment it's kind of really kind of prominent and kind of really out there for you. And, do you want to tell us a little bit about the book?
Yeah, absolutely. So Neurodivergent Affirming Therapy, it's called, and its subtitle is Rethinking Approaches for Autistic and ADHD Clients. And really, it's the book that I needed when I started with clients. In fact, my very first client was autistic. And I think I struggled with what I'd learned in my counselling training and what I was actually seeing in the therapy room. And there seemed to be this mismatch. There seemed to be something else that these clients were needing. And although I felt a kind of rapport with them, and now I know why, because I'm neurodivergent too, but I still felt there was something missing. And I searched and searched for a book or a resource that would help me. And I think at the time, so this is going back some years, but really the books were all about, were written by people who were so-called experts, autism experts, ADHD experts. And often they weren't autistic themselves or ADHD themselves. And they were writing from that position of talking about these things as if they're disorders, very much talking about the deficits. A lot of the books created a very us and them kind of vibe. It was all kind of very othering, and it never sat right with me. those books. I have a few of them on my shelf, and some things were useful, but generally it never sat well with me. And what was happening at the same time on the internet was the community of the autistic community, the ADHD community, coming together with a completely different way of viewing neurodivergence, which is kind of the neurodiversity paradigm. And this was great for me. Like, it was fantastic. And that's what I did my deep dive on. Really learnt from so many people, learnt from the lived experiences of other people. And it's been really fantastic. But yeah, no resources that sort of followed that. So this is the book, really. That's the idea, that it's the book that I could have really done with to help support those clients, both from a kind of theoretical position, but also some practical suggestions in there for things you can actually take away and do immediately and change immediately, potentially, about your practice.
Wow.
Yeah,
Yeah, God, that sounds great, doesn't it? And I kind of get that when you're talking about, sometimes these books are written by people that don't experience it on a personal level at all. They just don't, they're so-called experts. They come out with lots of things. And as you say, some of that is really useful. But what I'm hearing from you is that at that time, that just wasn't, it did not align with you properly, and you wanted to create something that genuinely did. And I love that. I think it's come out from a real need, hasn't it? A place of needing, rather than just
definitely.
I want to write a book. It's come from a place of you really knowing your stuff and understanding on a professional level, but also on a personal level, which I think is really special. I've been lucky enough to read the book and, have so loved it. And one of the things that kind of really struck me in the very early part of the book was your take on language and talking about language and how that's really, kind of important. And I wonder what it was that sparked that for you. There was something about the way that language is and the way that we talk about neurodivergence. What did that feel like for you? And what was the reason that you wanted to put a very specific part about language in the book?
I think language is so important. I think it is just generally. And there is a lot in there about actually what language means to people. And there's a lot of talk with neurodivergence about labeling. You often hear, like, why would you want to label yourself? Those kind of things get said quite a lot to neurodivergent people. And actually, I think a label in itself is like we label everything to give it meaning. Like, we have words to give meaning to things, to help us explain things, whether that's explaining the difference between a cat and a dog, or whether it's explaining some really complex abstract ideas. We need language, we need labels to be able to do that. And I think for neurodivergent people, very often we've had the experience where we've ended up labeling ourselves, perhaps with quite negative labels, like mine were kind of, I'm lazy, or I'm boring, or I'm awkward. It might be kind of, I'm too sensitive. And we label ourselves these things because we don't have any other way to describe ourselves. So we default to the negative. And language, as I describe it in the book, has been, it's not my way of speaking as such. It comes from the neurodiversity paradigm, which is the idea that actually neurodivergence is neutral. We're not talking about a superpower, but we're also not talking about something that's a deficit or a disorder. It's just a natural form of human variation, essentially. And the language that comes with that gives us the language to be able to label ourselves accurately. And I just think, why wouldn't we choose those labels that really relate to us, to help us explain ourselves to other people, to understand ourselves for ourselves? Why wouldn't we do that? So language is so important for the neurodivergent individual, but also for people working with them. Because
Yes.
actually we have this sort of history of the language of deficits and disorders, which has been brought forward into our therapy models and into our therapy rooms, that with the best will in the world, we can very unintentionally impart some of the stigma and shame that we're not meaning to, but we can do that in the room as a therapist by accident if we don't do this learning for ourselves,
Yeah, that
if
makes
that
so
makes
much
sense.
sense. It really does make sense. What are the things that you wish that you had known when you started out doing this?
Oh, wow. There's quite a list,
Yeah,
hence
I'm
the
not
book.
surprised.
um, I think the tricky thing is we learn a lot in counselling training. It's a hell of a lot to take on. You go into placement, there's so much to remember anyway. But I think the biggest thing is that I'd brought with me, accidentally, unintentionally, those stigma and biases that we kind of all grew up with, the misunderstanding about autistic people, misunderstanding about ADHDers. And I brought that with me even because I didn't know I was autistic and ADHD either. And that stigma just underlies a lot of the therapy models that we're learning about. So you can be in counselling training and you're picking up this stuff around Freud or around Jung or about Rogers. But actually, what we also ought to be doing, I think, is critiquing those models from a modern standpoint and looking at, okay, how can we adapt this? How can we adapt our approach for 21st century therapy, basically? So, yeah, I don't know that I can pinpoint one thing at the moment, but I suspect there will be more as we chat. But certainly, I think that I guess the thing I'm thinking of is it's okay to kind of question those modalities and approaches and kind of adapt them for the client in the room. It's okay to do that. And that would have been really helpful to know, I think, when
Yeah,
I was starting out.
so you didn't sort of feel straitjacketed by the models. You would have felt as if you were able to be, more flexible. Because as we speak so often in counselling, don't we, about how this is not a one size fits all solution. Everybody is so different. Everybody needs something different. Whether you're neurodivergent or not, there's going to be things that are different depending on where you go with it and who you are and what you want to get out of therapy. So it's going to be around how you tailor to each individual person sat in front of you. And like you said, if had you known that when you were training, perhaps on placement, that would have been, so helpful, wouldn't it, to recognize that? How has it kind of impacted your work since you yourself got diagnosed with autism and ADHD? What has that
Yeah.
impacted your work in any way?
Yeah, definitely. I think probably more the kind of self-realization before, and then later the diagnosis was kind of just the confirmation, I guess. But yeah, definitely made a difference. I think it's made me more able to accommodate myself as a therapist, in the room. It's made me be able to, because I always felt I related to my neurodivergent clients like so much. And I think I've learned so much from clients as much as anywhere else, really. And I think it's one of those things that you bring your whole self into the counselling room. I just don't think we can help that. I think we just do. And where I realized that I'd spent a lot of my life masking my neurodivergent traits, it was like a realization of like, oh, okay, so maybe what would it be like to actually be me in the room? Maybe not completely unmasked, but maybe just perhaps it's something like I'll totally own if I forget a word or something like that. A word will go, or I'll start to go off on a tangent and then bring myself back or something like that. I'll own that and I'll say to the client, oh, like I've totally just done that, or totally just been distracted by squirrel outside the window or whatever, very typical ADHD thing.
Yeah.
So that kind of thing I'll bring into the room. And
Yes.
then I think the clients, particularly the neurodivergent clients, will relate to that too. So I think that helps with that kind of rapport. But yeah, it helps for me to be able to accommodate myself to say, okay, how can I stop myself from burning out, stop myself from becoming overwhelmed? What do I need in the room? Not just what the clients need in the room, but what do I need? What do I need in my business? So how can I set that up that suits me and allows me to do all these wonderful things that I want to do? I've got to have a business that's set up so that I can do that. And it's really just given me permission to do that. And it has changed everything about that practice.
Oh.
Um, yeah, it's been really transformative, I think.
I'm aware that I was just massively distracted by some sort of aircraft going over. I think it's probably TUI on their way to somewhere nice. Other airlines are available.
Brilliant.
But, yeah, I'm sure it's somebody nice. If anybody can hear a massive aeroplane in the background, that's what it was. But it slightly distracted me, I have to say, in that moment. I was kind of like, oh, never mind. It never took away from what you were saying, though. And it's around that. It's around bringing that into the space. And it was quite interesting that that was happening as you were talking about distractions and
Yes.
things. And I was thinking, yeah, it's
Mm,
so true. It's so true what can happen.
yeah.
Um, and it's a really kind of, for me, it's a real kind of special conversation to have because I myself was diagnosed with ADHD last year, and it has been one hell of a journey. And I've not brought that to this podcast yet. So it feels really special to be able to sort of share that here and talk about it with you. And For me, it's been a real steep learning curve, I guess. I've sort of survived in the world all of this time without knowing that I had ADHD, but knowing that I was struggling and I would struggle in certain areas of my life and certain areas of work. And I have to say that when I went for the assessment, I knew that I had it, if that makes sense, but I was still shocked when they told me that I did. It was still a massive shock. And it's been a real steep learning curve, but same as you, from what you're saying about how you would always really resonate with your neurodivergent clients. And I feel very similar to that. Like I sort of gravitate towards them and working with them in a certain way. And it just feels like a real special relationship. Not that it's not that they're not, all of them aren't special, but it feels very different sometimes. And for me, it's really changed my practice in the sense that a little bit like you, I don't try to mask as much, and I still mask a bit, of course, but I'm much more kind of forgiving of myself. And I think that's made a real big difference as a therapist that I can forgive myself when, I say the wrong word or I try and say a saying and I get it the wrong way round or whatever, or I get distracted. I'm able to kind of have that as part of our narrative in the therapy space. And so that's been a really big help for me. And yeah, it's something that I've just wanted to talk about. And I guess I haven't found the medium to do that. And having you here felt like the most perfect opportunity, really, to do that. So thank you for allowing that
Yeah.
space. And
No, thank you so much for sharing. Yeah, it's really lovely to have that conversation. And
yeah,
I think what you said there about the always kind of knowing something's wrong or always knowing you struggle in certain areas, but not knowing why. Like it's
yes,
such a common experience, right? You go through your whole life knowing that there's things you struggle with. And I don't know about you, but it becomes a kind of like an obvious thing to blame yourself. Like, why
100%.
am I not coping like everyone else? Why can I not do that thing? And you beat yourself up over it. And that's what I think a diagnosis or kind of realization or identification as ADHD or autistic can really do, because it can let you know that, oh, okay, this is why I struggle. It's not a personal failing. It's something that most people with ADHD are going to struggle with. Now, how can I accommodate myself? And like you say, you've got permission now to be more yourself, which is lovely.
Yeah, 100%. And, and as you said, things like overwhelm and burnout and how I've done that in the past, I've got myself really burnt out, in a really spectacular way. And I now know that I can't do things in the same way as I used to do them. I've had to adapt a lot. And I guess that would be one of my biggest pieces of advice, really, for any neurodivergent counsellors in training or qualified counsellors out there that themselves are working through some stuff, because we can't be all things to all people. And I think it's so important that we absolutely are able to make sure that we're taking care of ourselves, because if we don't take care of ourselves, then we're never going to be able to take care of our clients and do the work. So I think that's really important for us to be there, showing up as ourselves, but being, I guess, more alert to not burning ourselves out and not getting ourselves so overwhelmed. I did actually have a question from a listener, and she was saying something very similar. I think she said, what is it like to be a neurodivergent counsellor? And I thought,
Mm.
and I found it really interesting because at that time, I hadn't announced that I was a neurodivergent counsellor. And yet, when we were messaging backwards and forwards, I think it had probably been quite clear that I was a neurodivergent counsellor to another ADHD person. She was very much kind of aware of that, I guess. But for her, it was this sense of, how do you manage things like burnout as a
Yeah.
therapist, especially when you're training? And as you said, there's so much that you've got to do, isn't there, on placement and training, and you're trying to juggle so many things and everything's so new. How can we stop ourselves from getting burnt out?
That's such a good question. And I think there's no one easy answer, as there never is there with these kind of things. But I think burnout, one of the biggest causes of particularly neurodivergent burnout, is us not tending to our own needs.
Yeah.
And again, the good thing about being diagnosed or understanding yourself as neurodivergent is that you can start to work out what your needs actually are. Because if you've spent your life suppressing those needs and masking, then you probably don't even know what they are. And I think that's the biggest thing for me, is understanding, oh, okay, maybe I do have needs here and maybe I can sort of tend to them. So I think burnout comes when we're masking too much, when we're prioritizing other people's needs above our own. And often, and I'll find, certainly if I'm thinking about clients now, I'll find that clients will be saying, oh, well, I've got all of these things and I can't let any of them go. But when you actually sort of sit there and work it out, a lot of the things they're doing are out of duty, or because they feel too guilty about something, or because they're feeling they don't want to feel rejection from someone. So they'll say yes to it. And those are the things we can work on in therapy. And I think, therefore, for a counsellor who's neurodivergent, I would say those kind of things are really important. Working through those kind of internalized messages around what you should be doing, internalized messages around what's seen as professional, even because professionalism in itself is like we're holding ourselves up to these certain standards, which, you know, maybe they're appropriate, maybe they're not always appropriate, and actually we can make changes. So I think, yeah, it comes down to those fundamental needs. And also, I think trying to create the kind of environment that you need for you. So whether that is tending to your sensory needs and really tuning into what are the things I need from my sensory experience, what are the things that I need to try and avoid or cut out. And certainly in training, trying to get as much support as you can. I think that's really important to ask for help.
Yeah, I get that. And those reasonable adjustments that somebody can, make a really big difference, don't they?
Mm-hmm.
And it's around that. It's around being able to ask to get your needs met.
Mm.
And that's not always easy. And you don't want to sort of, I'll speak for myself. I don't always want to put myself out there as needing something. But at the same time, since being diagnosed, I think that's become easier for me to do and easier for me to reach out and to ask for help. And, talking even about ADHD with my supervisor is really helpful, and talking about how that kind of manifests itself in my work. And she was the most encouraging actually around me starting to put myself out there as a counsellor with ADHD, and, being able to little parts of my website which I've adapted now to sort of say, that I have lived experience of ADHD, and other ADHDers have been reaching out to me and, wanting therapy because they know that I get it on a different level now. And so that's been really special and something that I'm really glad that I've started to embrace. But it took me, well, a year and a bit to get to that point. And it's only been very recently that I've been able to start putting that out there. And I suppose when we were talking earlier about things that you wish that you'd known when you started working with the neurodivergent clients, because I know that you said before that your very first client was autistic, and I'm guessing that was on placement, right?
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm wondering whether that experience would have been different had you known yourself that you had ADHD and autism at that time.
Yes, definitely. I think so. I mean, it's something I disclose to all my clients. I mean, I'm very, obviously the book, I'm out there for neurodivergent anyway, and my website. But it's something that I do share because I think being able to have an experience with a counsellor who feels like they're on the same wavelength or could be on the same wavelength of you is really important. But so I think that's one thing that I may have been able to do. And also I think the work that I've done on myself because of those diagnoses has been infinitely, well, I wouldn't say more important than my counselling training, but as important as the counselling training I did before, because it's so much more, I'm so much more aware of myself and aware of those internal biases and messages, like I was saying, which we do that in counselling training, don't we? We do a lot of that, a lot of unearthing things. But when I was doing that and not knowing I was neurodivergent, there was stuff I still wasn't uncovering and didn't
Yes.
know it. And of course, there'll still be more. I'm sure like it could go on for years. But yeah, and I think that would have changed a lot
Yeah.
for me in that room with that client, definitely.
Yeah, it would have given another level of understanding, wouldn't it, on a
Yeah.
very, very deep and personal level.
Mm.
And I always find it quite strange when I look back over the work that I've done, since I qualified in 2012. I look back over all of the years that I've done this work. And I know that my ADHD means that I am able to really focus well when I need to on a client or a supervisee. I'm able to give them my all. For the time that I'm with them, and of course that can be absolutely exhausting afterwards. I kind of as soon as that person has left, I kind of go down a dip for a while because I give so much, and I see that that has been a real helpful strength for me as a professional working with people, but on a personal level, of course, at times that's led me to feeling burnt out and exhausted
Mm.
and needing to find a way to manage that. So now I'm much more careful with my diary planning. I'm much more careful around what I will do and what I will say I'll do, what I don't do. The other part of it, I think, as well, is around being kinder. I'm just much kinder to myself. And if I don't get things done in the time frame that I hoped I would get it done, then I'm kind of all right with that these days. It makes a real big difference, doesn't it? So I think for anybody working with clients, if they are a neurodivergent person trying to work with clients and they're just starting out as a therapist, I think that that knowledge of knowing what your needs are is absolutely crucial. And I wonder what your thoughts are actually on, so if someone's neurodivergent as a counsellor and they're going on placement, what would be your take on them asking for their own needs to be met via their placement provider?
Mm.
That's quite a big one, isn't it?
It is quite a big one because I think we're always very nervous, aren't we? Going into placement, we're always going to be nervous about what could be provided for us. We want to do our best. We want to show up as the kind of best counsellor on placement or what have you. So I think I can really understand why you'd be really nervous about that. I think it really depends on the placement, and it also massively depends on how you're feeling about stuff. So if you're very confident in your needs and you're very confident about knowing what those reasonable adjustments need to be and how that can help you, and you can verbalize that, then great. But for a lot of people, that could be really hard to verbalize and articulate. I would say it would probably be a good idea to go back to your training provider and get advice from them, because the likelihood is they're going to be familiar with the placements as well. But certainly ask, because depending on where you are, so my placement was in a college, so they were very used to working with students who had different special educational needs, etc. So it was something that, had I known back then, I think would have been a lot easier to ask for. But yeah, I think it really depends on where you are with it. And I think it's an interesting point you were saying earlier about how people maybe struggle to ask for those reasonable adjustments, don't want to feel like you're kind of stepping outside of what's considered normal or what have you. And I think that speaks to that internalized ableism that many of us, most of us, to be honest, will have. So we have these kind of messages that we've swallowed over the years about autism and ADHD, just as examples, but of course, disability in general as well. And that can mean that if you're neurodivergent yourself, the way that shows up is maybe not wanting to wear headphones in public or ear defenders in public, or not wanting to ask for help, not wanting to ask for reasonable adjustments, not wanting to be seen as a nuisance kind of thing. And those kind of messages we've ingrained. And that's something that I've got a whole chapter dedicated to working with ableism in the book, because we will see ableism within our clients who might be neurodivergent, but we will also see it in ourselves, whether we're neurodivergent or not. And I think that's a really good sort of point to make about how this is where this learning can really transform things, because we can unearth this and realize that, oh, okay, maybe I am judging this in a way based on previous misconceptions about disability or what have you. And that's where that can really help the neurodivergent counsellor to understand their own needs better as well.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Oh, it really does. And then I'm thinking about working with neurodivergent clients and thinking about them being able to voice their needs with you as a therapist, but also outside in society. Like, how do we voice our needs and how comfortable are we to do that? And that's the question. And I have to say, on a personal level, I have really struggled with that at times, not wanting to put anybody out, not wanting to make a fuss, not wanting to ask for something that's deemed to be different to what somebody else might need. But that's kind of got a little bit easier recently. And I'm not saying I'm there with it. I've still got a long way to go, but it's become easier through understanding. And I guess that is really important for clients as well. It's kind of something about neuro affirming therapy, isn't it, in that sense? And what's your kind of vision of what neuro affirming therapy is?
Yeah, I think essentially it is taking the ethos that neurodivergence is a neutral thing. Like I say, it's a natural part of the human condition, essentially, and being able to understand neurodivergent traits in a way that we can reflect that back to the client. So because the client, this is going to be quite a long answer, and I was hoping to come up with something nice and succinct that I could answer that with.
It
But it's
doesn't
going to end up
matter.
being quite long.
I think it's such an important topic. I think it's worth it.
Yeah.
If you've got it in you to answer it, it'd be great.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think when a client, oh, no, I've lost my train of thought completely. There's a perfect example for
Well,
you.
absolutely. So we're talking about, what is neuroaffirming therapy? What is that for a client?
Yes, so sorry.
That's
So in
okay.
terms of someone's neurodivergent traits, they may come in with a lifetime, either they've known they're neurodivergent, maybe they haven't, but a lifetime of this kind of understanding of the deficits and it being a disorder, because that's what we were all told. Right from when we were very young, that's what we were what we would read in books, what we would see in the media, and so on. So they've come with a lifetime of that, and they might come with something like, for instance, an ADHD are getting really distracted, not being able to focus. That might be something that they're sat there in your therapy room and they're framing everything through this lens, really, through this lens of disorder. If you, as the counsellor, can understand neurodivergent traits in this more affirming way, you can reflect those traits back to that client in a way that can be transformative. So you are affirming their neurodivergence. Again, you're not saying it's a superpower. You're not saying you're disordered. What you're saying is, oh, that makes sense for an ADHD that you might get distracted at those times. And also, you can bring in the fact that, as you were saying earlier, there are times when you can be hyper focused, and that can be incredibly valuable. How do we make sure and balance things so that you don't get burnt out? That could be a great conversation to have for that client. So, neurodivergent affirming approach is by understanding neurodivergence from a lived experience perspective, not from that perspective of the doctor or the teacher or the so called expert. And as I say, reflecting that back to the client in a way that helps them see it through this different lens. I'm sure there's more I could say about it.
No, that sounds absolutely perfect. I mean, that is the crux of it all, really, isn't it? And I was just thinking, because I was getting distracted slightly as you were talking then, I was thinking about if you are a neurotypical counsellor, do you believe that you can offer true neuro-affirming therapy?
Yes, absolutely, I do. But I do think you have had to have done your work, and that's hopefully where the book comes in, because it takes you on that journey. Because although I think if you're a neurodivergent counsellor with a neurodivergent client, there can be, obviously, there are going to be differences as well, but there can be similarities that can really help that client. However, I mean, that one thing, there's not enough of us to go around.
That's
That's the other
true.
thing. So we need neurotypical counsellors to do this work. Absolutely. And in fact, I'll go on a slight tangent here, but the idea of neurotypical is not a specific neurotype. Neurotypical isn't a neurotype that we can kind of identify very easily. Neurotypical is just really people who are more able to fit into societal norms.
Oh, yeah, that's a good way of
So
putting it.
yeah. So when you're masking, when you're like me, autistic ADHD, and I'm masking, I'm performing neurotypicality, essentially.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, it really does.
So therefore, for a counsellor who maybe, let's say, isn't autistic, isn't ADHD, isn't anything else under the neurodivergent umbrella, but they have done this work on understanding neurodivergence through this lens, can absolutely be there for that client in a neurodivergent affirming way. And I think it just takes us as counsellors to be a bit humble. Like, I mean, come on, like all our training we do, we get so uncomfortable, don't we? We have to get into the uncomfortable stuff. And yeah, and I will say with the book, like it's not all comfortable. There will be things that you come up against, I think, where you're having to dig deep and reflect on lots of different things. But I think that's the most valuable work. And actually, that's the work I'm most excited to do with myself, the getting into the uncomfortable stuff. And if you can do that, then absolutely that makes you all the better counsellor for neurodivergent and other clients alike, I think.
Yes, I get that. Yeah, and thank you for kind of clarifying that around language as well. I think it's another thing, isn't it, that is really difficult. I think sometimes people do worry about language and about how they describe people. And I think that that can be really difficult. So I like the way that you're very clear on the language, because I think that clarity can just be really helpful to give people the confidence to talk and have conversations that feel very open without feeling worried about saying the wrong word or saying it accidentally wrong. And I think it's just about actually how do we make it an accessible topic for everybody? Because I think that certainly as an ADHD myself, that sense of I don't very often tell people, I find it really difficult to sort of say, this is who I am. I've still got quite a few friends that don't know. And I don't know why that is. I'm quite sort of private about it. But I wonder whether if the language was more widely available to us all, whether it would be easier for me to talk about it and maybe easier for other people to ask me about it as well. And
Mm.
I don't know, it's something about language keeps coming up for me today. I've thought about it a few times as we've been talking about language and how we put ourselves out
Mm.
there. Does that kind of make any sense?
It does, absolutely. And I think, yeah, language, as I said at the beginning, is really important. But when we're talking about if we're in the therapy room, then everyone's going to have their personal preferences about how they refer to themselves. And like, we're not going to come in and bulldoze over that.
No.
We're going to be person centered and respect that, of course. But it's about, yes, like you said, having the confidence that you know why this language is preferred by many of the, let's say, autistic community. So, for example, being autistic rather than being a person with autism.
Yes.
So usually being autistic is the widely preferred term amongst the autistic community. Of course, that's not going to be everybody, but if you can know that and know the reasons why that is the preferred term, then I think it makes you more confident to do so,
Yes.
to talk
Yes.
about it.
I think that's really important. And how would you, if you met a student counsellor today that's wanting to work, going out on placement, and maybe they're going to work with a neurodivergent client, what would you like to kind of give them in terms of advice? Like, is there anything that you would share with
Mm.
them to help make this easier?
I would say one of the biggest things I think about being a counsellor generally is about getting curious with the client,
Yeah.
just generally. So if you're getting curious with someone who's neurodivergent, I would be asking, well, what's that like for you, for that client? I would be asking, how do you prefer to talk about yourself? How would you like me to respond to you? Is there anything I can do to make this experience more comfortable? So you're collaborating with your client. And the point is about neurodivergent affirming therapy is we're not doing this and then it's not hindering other people. So any clients that come can benefit from this kind of approach. I think that's really important to say. So why wouldn't we do it? Because it's going to benefit them. And we and I think for those maybe student therapists that are going out into placement and so on, it's about being confident to ask questions of the client, being confident to collaborate with them, and being okay with like it doesn't have to be fixed. As I said earlier, you can be flexible with things and think about, okay, how could I do this differently? So lean on your supervisor, obviously, and talk to them about how you might want to work with that neurodivergent client in particular. And there are specific things that we could go into if that's, useful. But I think generally being curious is one of the most important things.
Yeah, that curiosity. And I always sort of have a bit of a mantra that it's not a one size fits all solution, is it? For anybody, for any client or any supervisee that we work with, it's not a one size fits all. And I think that is fundamental in terms of all counselling and being able to, I don't know, really sit with somebody in the room and see them for them, regardless, and not recognise, not have this feeling of, oh, I did that with that client, that worked really well, so I need to do that again each time now with every client. It's not going to work. We've got to be so much more flexible. And as you said, that word curious, I really liked that. We can be curious and we can collaborate and we can work in a way that feels we're in it together. Does that kind of, does that, hope that resonates with what you were saying?
Definitely. I think it's the humanity, isn't it? It's being another human in the room. That's
Yes.
one of the most important things. It's that relational aspect.
Yes.
That's actually something that might be quite interesting to think about, like relationally, how
Hmm.
that could be different with, let's say, an autistic client. Would
Yeah,
that be
that'd be
worth going
really
into?
helpful. I think that would be amazing if you could share a little bit about that.
Yeah. I was just thinking about for autistic clients in particular, but this might also apply to other neurodivergent clients. So there's something called the double empathy problem. Now, autistic people are often viewed as having no empathy or a lack of empathy quite often. And even to the point where many autistic counsellors get sort of told early in their career, well, you can't be a counsellor because you're autistic, you don't have empathy, which is
Gosh, that's awful.
completely wrong. And
Yeah.
and a complete myth. But in terms of this, the double empathy problem says that autistic people, and could be neurodivergent in general too, have spent their entire lives trying to fit into that neurotypical norm, trying to mask themselves, maybe trying to figure out the rules of what it means to be a human in the world, in our society at least. And so, autistic people, we've spent all this time and effort doing that. We don't get that back from neurotypical people, in inverted commas. And so there's no kind of adjustment that other people need to make in their communication for autistic people, or traditionally there hasn't been. And that's the double empathy problem. It's not that autistic people lack empathy, it's that actually there's not enough empathy for the autistic experience coming back the other way.
Oh, yes, that makes sense.
And so that can play out in the therapy room. If you imagine you've got a client in front of you, maybe they're not showing empathy in the way you'd expect, they're not showing their feelings on their face in the way you'd expect, and you make assumptions about them not having empathy, for example, because they're autistic. What's that going to do relationally to you and that client? So what's happening there is we can end up completely missing the client, completely missing their real experience. And that client's going to go away feeling like, oh, I've been misunderstood again. Oh, I need to try harder. I need to try something different. I need to figure out how to be the perfect client, etc. So relationally, that can really affect things. And I think that's something that for student therapists, but any therapist actually, is a really important thing to know, that autistic people can express empathy differently, express emotion differently. And it doesn't mean they're not feeling it. It's just it's not coming out in the way you typically expect. And that's something worth exploring, I think. And there's lots of ways to explore that creatively, and so on. So, yeah, I think that's a really important thing.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up actually, because that feels fundamental, doesn't it, in the therapy space that clients can come in, they can be themselves and that they don't find themselves having to try to fit a mold in order to come for therapy. So that was a really great explanation, and I really appreciate you taking the time to explain that, because there'll be quite a lot of people out there that maybe have never heard of that, or perhaps have heard of it but never quite understood what it was. So I really appreciate that and the time that you've taken to explain. One of the things that I've got on my list to sort of mention to you is around rejection. And I know I'm sort of going off on a slight tangent now for where we were, but it feels really important in the sense that as a ADHD counsellor, I can often really struggle with those feelings of rejection. And I know that we're specifically talking about rejection sensitive dysphoria, RSD, aren't we here? And for me, that's been a real big issue at times. And sometimes it's the lack of feedback that we get in the counselling world as well. It forms part of that. But what are your thoughts on RSD and being a counsellor, both from a counsellor's perspective, but also potentially a client's perspective too?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess from a client's perspective, so for any counsellors, whether you're neurodivergent or not, it is really important to be aware of how neurodivergent clients can often be sensitive to rejection. And that can be from a lifetime of trauma, a lifetime of miscommunication, misunderstandings. And that brings with it this huge wash of emotion when we feel rejected or we perceive a rejection. So that's really, really common for neurodivergent people. So if you've got a neurodivergent client, it could be as simple as you, as their therapist, checking the clock to see what the time is. And the client has watched you check the clock. And then maybe the client's internal their mind is going through, oh, like, oh, Becky wants me to finish now. She's had enough of me. Oh, I always talk too much. Oh, it must be time. I must be going on and on. Oh,
Mm.
I'm really rubbish. And go into this kind of critical mindset, really. And this rejection response, which comes with a lot of shame generally. It's usually a shame response. So that client could be going through that just from you having looked at the clock. And obviously, like, we have to look at the clock, don't we? We have to sort of keep an eye on things. That's part of our job. But just to be aware that that could be happening so that you can bring it into the room if you notice something on their face, some sort of response, it really gives you a clue also to what might be going on with them in the rest of their lives if they've got these big responses to things which would ordinarily be considered something that maybe for some people would just sort of be water off a duck's back type of thing. But for many neurodivergent people, that's going to be very painful, emotionally very, very painful. So it's really important for us to be aware of that as the counsellor. I also think as a neurodivergent counsellor, if we're talking about from that side of the therapy room, I think for me, it's a huge deal. The rejection sensitive stuff for me has come up so much around my private practice. It might just be a client, like for instance, if a client ghosts you or something, or a client just disappears, oh, like that can hit so hard. And it's really important to have your kind of evidence for why you're a good counsellor, all of those things, nice things people have said to you in the past, or those things that you can turn to in those moments. And also find things that are going to help you get through those responses. So whether that's like a nice sensory break or whatever it is you might need to help you regulate in that moment. But mostly it's being aware of it, I think, because if you're aware that your responses are going to be heightened like that, it's much easier to explain it to yourself. And I often do a bit, I mean, my rejection sensitivity has been off the charts. If you think about like releasing a book, it's been huge. Um, so and reading Amazon reviews and things like that, it's like, oh God, how is
Oh,
this going to be? How is this going to be received? So I often talk to myself. If I feel that kind of response, I will actually talk to myself and say, like, it's okay, like yes, that review is not so good, or that this is not so good, or whatever, but it's okay, you're not alone, we're doing this, we're smashing it, all of these good things are happening. And just kind of trying to self-soothe a bit in those moments, I think that can be really helpful. I've found that really helpful. But yeah, it comes up in all sorts of areas of practice, I think. And it's
yes.
a really tricky one for the majority of neurodivergent, certainly autistic and ADHDers that I meet. It's
Yeah, I
really
really get
tricky.
that. Yeah. And it's funny you talking about the clock thing really reminded me of something that happened to me when, funny enough, I was on placement, but I had to go because I was training. Obviously, you have to have personal therapy, don't you? And I went to see a therapist of which I shall not name. Um, and I was seeing that therapist to cover some of my personal counselling hours for my course. And this particular therapist felt like they were repeatedly looking at the clock, which was kind of on the wall above my shoulder. And I shut down. And of course, at that point, I didn't know I had ADHD, but I couldn't find my trail of thought because my instant response to it was, well, they've obviously had enough of me already, and I've only just got here. And it felt like I'd only been in the room for maybe sort of 10 minutes or so. And it already felt like they were looking at the clock a lot. And I felt ever so uncomfortable about it. And I never voiced it in the room. I didn't really know what to say. But it was literally one session I had with that person. I never went back again because I felt this huge sense of, oh, I must be boring them.
Mm.
Maybe they don't really want me here. Maybe they've got somewhere else better that they want to be. And I really took it hard. And I never knew at that time why. I just went away and just thought, oh no, I'm not going back there again. And it just felt like I was literally closed down. And so you were saying about that reminded me of that. And when I teach counselling, it's one of the things I say to people is be subtle about the clock. I know that we need to, like you rightly say, we need to have an eye on the time, but just be
Mm.
subtle about it. If you don't need to
Yeah,
look at it repeatedly, just be subtle. And
absolutely.
I think it can be really challenging. But
Mm.
I think as a therapist, that RSD can really kick in when, like as you say, someone doesn't show up for a session, or you get ghosted by them. And even that lack of feedback that occurs, that I'm not expecting feedback from clients. I don't ask for it. I'm never going to ask for it, but I've got to work really hard on that for myself, because it's not a job where you're going to have an appraisal, or, you're going to meet with your manager once every couple of months and they're going to tell you how great you are. There's none of that happening. And so I know for me, that rejection feeling has been high at times. And I start to then
Mm,
question whether I'm good enough as a therapist. And the imposter syndrome kicks in. There's just so many different kind of facets to that, isn't there? But I
yeah,
think it's always
definitely.
an interesting topic for everybody to
Mm,
understand, really. So,
definitely. And I was going to say there with your example there, and I think needing to have a supervisor who is really good at this stuff, knows their stuff. So if you're seeing neurodivergent clients or you're neurodivergent yourself, then I would definitely consider either a neurodivergent supervisor or someone that has done this work and will be able to provide that neurodivergent affirming supervision, really, so that you can bring your rejection stuff there and kind of work through it with them as well, potentially. And if you're also having your own personal counselling, that can help too, obviously, too, as well. But yeah, the lack of feedback is a really interesting one, because I also think if a client is struggling with rejection stuff, sometimes that's because they're not getting the feedback from us as the counsellor.
yeah, that's a good
So
point.
that's where explaining more of our processes can be so important. So just something like leaving silence, and lots of modalities talk about silence, don't they, as a therapeutic method. But with silence, for example, someone who's going to feel quite sensitive to rejection could be sitting there thinking all sorts of things, while we as the counsellor are thinking, oh, this is a good therapeutic silence, we're going to use it in this way. And that might be really relevant and useful, yes, of course. But let's let the client into why this is happening.
Yeah, that's
We
such a
might
good
even
point.
talk about them beforehand and say, how are you if I leave silences? Like, what is that going to be like for you? Because for some people, it's going to be fine. For others, it will be the difference between them staying in counselling and then or not coming back to you because of how that feels in that moment. So it's giving the information, it's letting them a little bit see behind the curtain a little bit. Like, this is why I'm using this approach. Like, it's not because I want you to feel uncomfortable. It's actually because of this. And if that's not going to work for you, let's adapt it. So I think
Yes.
that's like quite a nice example in terms of the feedback.
Yeah, so sort of opening up a conversation right at the beginning around, what to expect in therapy
Mm.
and what might happen sometimes. And as you say, checking out with them about what that might feel like, and understanding that that might be uncomfortable, in which case do we adapt, or do we sit with the discomfort? Like, what do we do? But we have an open conversation about that, don't we? I'm aware that we're rapidly running out of time, but I wanted to ask you one more thing, if I may, before we finish. And it's around perhaps the tools that we might use as a therapist working with neurodivergent clients. And I know that you've got these amazing cards, and I reckon that people out there might be really interested in those as well. And I just thought I wanted to ask you about whether you'd like to tell us a little bit about them, and any other tools that you think might be helpful for the people listening.
Yeah, I'd love to. So yeah, my neurocards is what they're called. They are 42 therapy cards, and each of them has a neurodivergent trait or experience on them. So that'll range from things like rejection sensitivity we've been talking about. It might be shutdowns, it might be meltdowns, it might be things like creativity to sort of spark discussion. And the idea is there's an image on one side, and then on the back, a description of the trait or experience and a discussion prompt, like a question that you can ask clients, for example. So I came up with these, I think about 4 years ago now, because again, like I just couldn't, as we were saying at the beginning, I couldn't find resources for my neurodivergent clients that fitted with this more neurodivergent affirming approach. So I created them originally for my clients, and then they just became so popular with other therapists. It's been brilliant. And you can use them because they are talking about neurodivergent traits in a way that are non-pathologizing. So we're not pathologizing any of these experiences. We're saying we're normalizing them, really. We're saying, look, this is something lots of people experience. Let's have a conversation about them. So they can be a conversation starter, good for young people, particularly when you will kind of want to explore. Maybe they've just started to think about neurodivergence. Maybe they're going for an assessment. And whilst it's not a diagnostic tool, it can still be quite a helpful thing to sit through and kind of work through the things to figure out, okay, what do I feel about this? And they're also used in groups and in schools and things like that now as well. And even in some businesses have purchased them to use in for their line managers to have conversations with their employees, which
Wow.
is amazing because like
Yeah.
that's brilliant. If we're having a conversation about this, it's like I said about curiosity earlier. If we can have the conversation, then yeah, we can all learn more about it. So that's why I produced them really, so that we could sit with clients and give them something tangible to hold. So yeah, and I'm really proud of them and amazed at how well that they've, how well they've been received. And that really did start everything. And then I think the kind of books come later on as the sort of result of those things.
Yeah.
But yeah, in terms of other tools, I think the main thing is to look for tools which don't pathologize. That is the biggest thing when it comes to neurodivergence. So there are a lot more out there now than there were when I started the cards 4 years ago. But I think just be cautious about what you're using with clients in terms of just have a think to yourself, what is this saying to the client about their neurodivergent traits? Is it leaving things open for discussion, which is always going to be good? Does it involve collaboration with the client, which is always going to be good? Or does it kind of pigeonhole them into a particular thing? And are you a bit worried about that? So definitely keeping an eye out on that for neurodivergent tools. But generally, I'd say in the therapy room, creative tools are incredibly useful for neurodivergent people. Obviously, not all of them will be popular with everyone. It will depend on the client in front of you. I've certainly found working with sound trays, working with music is a great one. And I said earlier about how maybe autistic people in particular might struggle to express their feelings in a particular way. They might also struggle to identify their feelings too. So using things like music, for instance, like I could probably, if I might struggle to identify a feeling and name it to you, but I might know of a song that like perfectly captures it. So
Yes.
maybe in the room we're going to play that song. Maybe we're going to look at the lyrics and think, oh, why does
Oh,
that resonate so much? Using things like that can be so helpful. And again, helpful for all clients, right? So
yeah, I
helpful
love
to have
that.
those tools in our toolbox, I think.
Yeah, I love that idea of music. That's such a good idea. Genuinely, like, you could both hear the same thing. You could both listen to the lyrics together and talk about what that might mean. What's your take on things like those emotion wheels and things like that?
Yeah, I think emotion wheels, I do use them and can be very helpful. I think it's great for building that emotional vocabulary, and many autistic and ADHD people haven't had that emotional vocabulary, maybe because their parents are undiagnosed neurodivergence. That might be part of it too, and for all sorts of other reasons. So they can be really helpful, but I also think like it's good to have those words available. I also, like, if I'm thinking of myself, I probably couldn't tell you what they feel like.
Okay,
So the
yeah,
nuance of those feelings, I'd probably struggle to tell you what that feels like in my body. So I do a lot of work around reconnecting with the body. So
yes,
looking at mindfulness exercises or body scans or something, things that people can build into their daily life to help them reconnect with their body so that then you can build in the vocabulary and start to kind of work on that emotion side of things.
yeah, that does make a lot of sense because I'm personally very disconnected from my body a lot of the time. I'm not, I can't often name the feelings in my body at all. So that does make a lot of sense to me. And to use these things in connection with each other. And again, about recognizing there's not a one size fits all. Everybody's going to be so different, aren't they?
Definitely.
Yeah. So I just want to say to you a huge thank you for coming in. This has been amazing to have you here. And I've absolutely loved every moment of this. Where can people get the book?
So the book is available at all online book retailers. So you can get it from Amazon and Waterstones and TG Jones and places like that.
Yeah, it's very exciting. And maybe if I pop an Amazon link or something in the show notes for the podcast, would that be helpful?
Yes, that would be great. Yeah, thank you. But also you can find more information on my website as well if anybody wants to look there too.
Yeah, I could pop that in the notes as well. I put a couple of links out there for you. So thank you so much for joining me. What an interesting topic. I wish we'd had longer, actually. I probably could have talked to you for another hour at least, but it's been absolutely lovely. And thank you so much for your time today. And
Oh, you're
yeah,
welcome.
and good luck with the book.
Thank you so much, Becky. Yeah, it's been really nice to talk to you. Thank you.
Wasn't that just absolutely amazing to have Amy here? What a lovely conversation and how useful. Thank you again, Amy. I so appreciated our time together. And for everybody else, thank you so much for listening. I really hope you got something from this episode. Be sure to check out Amy's wonderful book and all the other resources that she has available. But if you've enjoyed this podcast and you'd like to give me a lovely 5-star review, I would be so grateful. In the meantime, take good care of yourselves, everybody, and I'll catch you soon. Bye-bye.